computer?
Yes.
So I finally hit record on this. I want to welcome everybody who may be listening. This is a video that's going to be available to everybody that is participating in this group. This group is kind of known as the Inkblots. Doug is a new addition to this group. This is a group of friends who have been talking for a while. And I have to answer the question where the term Inkblots come from. Some people who are familiar with church history know that there are two wonderful authors, J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who wrote many different things, and of course some well-loved fantasy literature. And they were part of a group in Oxford known as the Inklings. Well, we certainly aren't up to the Inkling standard, therefore we are the Inkblots. We're lucky if we make any sense at all. So the purpose of this group and the recording of this group is to provide some area of conversation. So everybody in this group is related to working in the church somehow. And the idea that I had in presenting this to this group of friends is that we would just have some theological conversation. And this may help you or send you down a deeper path to explore some different theological topics. Or it may be something you watch a few minutes of and go, boy, these guys are really crazy. Either way, it's fine with me. It might give you a few minutes of distraction. So after I finish my part, I've asked everybody to go around and share a little bit about themselves before we get started. And that'll probably only be a part of this video. I am Jonathan Hall. I am an ordained elder in the Methodist Church serving in Cottonwood, Arizona. I'm actually sitting outside, even though the background is a fake background. So if you hear a motorcycle or something, I'll try to mute my mic in time, but it may not happen. So that's a little bit about me, and the next person in line is Doug.
So I'm a recovering United Methodist. Taught college for a number of years, CEO for some healthcare, substance abuse recovery, and mental health, and then went into full-time ministry. Retired out of that, ordained in 1999, 2000, and then ended up retired and in Arizona, was assigned to try to work through at Cottonwood some financial issues and whatever. That's where Jonathan and I met. Actually, it probably was a result of God's intervention, because the prayers for Cottonwood, both by myself and from many of the devoted people there, was that they would get somebody who would fit. A younger pastor, someone who would help lead them into the future, would want to stay with them and be a part of them. And so when I was all through with Cottonwood, they assigned me to Mission Bell United Methodist Church in Phoenix, Arizona, or Glendale. And so that's where I serve presently as a part-time United Methodist pastor. Part-time, yeah, it's never part-time. Anyway.
So my name is Gene Stevenson, originally from Pennsylvania, but currently living with my family in Flagstaff, Arizona. Former pastor, not in that work anymore, but I am the executive director of a religious nonprofit. And I have been in and around Christian higher education for a number of years, primarily as a student, but more recently as an instructor and as an administrator as well. So those are some of my credentials. And Jonathan and I met while I was still pastoring. He and I were actually pastors in the same town, and our congregations were about a block down the road from each other. So rather than seeing each other as rivals, we saw a good opportunity to build a relationship there. And so our families have been friends pretty much ever since. and they were the ones that first drew our attention to Arizona, and that's a story for another time. But yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So
I'm assuming that's a genuine thanks, not a thanks a lot.
yes. No, it's a thanks. It's a thank you.
Oh, all right. Go ahead, Ray.
Oh, my name is Ray Holland, and I am an ordained United Church of Christ pastor serving in central Pennsylvania. I have two small rural churches, originally from Connecticut, but have been serving here for many years now. A different culture, but wonderful people to work with. And as part of my ministry, I also work part-time at a local public library. And trust me, there's plenty of ministry to do there as well. Thanks.
Brief and to the point, like a good UCC pastor. Thanks you. So the format of this, or the idea behind this, is that we will posit a question and just kind of mull it over and talk about it, whatever stands out to each of us. And the question that I first want to posit, one that kind of stuck with me, is when we look at our world today, everybody knows the church is different. Everybody knows we're trying to do church differently. But this has also pushed a lot of us into the online realm and interacting with various different theologies. And sometimes those differences can become very apparent. So one of the things I've been watching is this idea that the reason the coronavirus is happening is a punishment for sin. And we can pin that, well, some people can pin that to a lot of different types of sin. But in my opinion, it stems back to this kind of remnant theology idea, where this remnant theology works its way through Scripture, where the small part of God's people who are the true chosen people. And my experience, and this is where the discussion will come in, my experience is that what we see a lot of happening right now online in pushing that sin has caused this narrative is this kind of remnant theology, that we are the chosen people and anybody who does anything religiously different than us is bad or wrong or has helped cause this. So what do you guys think? Am I right? Am I wrong? Or is it something different?
I'll jump in first because I have two different ideas about remnant theology. And I should say, quoting the good folks at Car Talk on NPR, their tagline at the end of the show is, "The questions have been carefully researched. The answers, of course, have not." Mm-hmm. So my two impressions are, when I see other people articulating what is a remnant theology, what I see is self-righteousness, judgmentalism, our way or the highway. And sometimes that can be narrowed down not just to a denomination, but to an individual church or even an individual pastor. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I sometimes use remnant theology, at least mentally, to console myself that at least we are still doing what we can. We are still being faithful, even if it looks like the church is diminishing bit by bit. And at least we're still trying to do what we can. And I remember Mother Teresa saying, I never asked you to be successful, just faithful. So I comfort myself with that aspect of remnant theology, which probably means somebody from the outside would look at me as self-righteous and judgmental. But those are my perspectives on it.
So just to clarify, and you might hear a truck coming around.
It's a weighty subject.
I would say I'd edit that out, but I'm not really capable of editing anything out, so it's not going to happen. So to clarify what you're saying, Ray, if I understood you right, you're basically claiming there are two different, different but related parts of remnant theology. where there's that negative aspect of being judgmental, the us versus them. But then there's
Right.
a positive aspect where it can bind a community together. Is that what I'm understanding, right?
Yeah, I think so, because there are days when the only thing I can do is look out at the congregation and the many, many empty pews and say, it doesn't matter how many we are being faithful. So yeah, I think that maybe there's other ways to look at it as well, but I'd say those are two ways to look at it.
True.
I think it's an interesting conundrum, because regardless of what where you come from, and we've seen this at least in this conference in Arizona, that it's a fairly liberal conference, and there are fewer conservatives than there are liberals, and that if it were a more highly conservative population, then they would be claiming that they had all the answers.
Sure.
But it's a liberal approach here, and they still claim that they have all the answers.
Of course.
So it's like looking at it from two different angles. I think the best approach that I could have, my best understanding, comes out of dealing in the drug treatment industry, where there is no one way to get sober. I mean, you can choose the AA path, you can go to a long-term treatment facility. Some people do it on their own, and regardless of how they got to sobriety, the simple fact was they believe that that's the way that it has to be done. And it's because they have that experience. So philosophically, when you start to get into the other areas of discussion here, I don't know that any of us are equipped to figure out exactly, what the answer is. I think I'm a student, continuous student, looking at different avenues of understanding. And so, I understand why some people think that that sin has caused this situation, but we've been sinning for generations. We're not righteous people. We're sinners saved by grace, and so.
But that's part of the question. So to put back at you, Doug, if we are the students, so let's go under the assumption that the four of us, because we're even having this conversation, are willing to admit that we don't have all the answers. That's why the more aggressive form of remnant theology doesn't really work for us, because we're going, well, wait a minute, this side does have a pretty good solution. How do we interact, encounter, or change the other side when it becomes very damaging? That type of dialogue becomes very damaging. So Ray, you referenced self-righteousness. If you listen to many stories of people who used to attend the church and no longer attend the church, they will say it's because it's full of self-righteous people. They talk the talk, they don't walk the walk. So especially in an online world, how do we push back against that if we're constantly the student?
I think one of the most powerful ways we can respond, whether it's online or in person, is, I don't know, but I'll find out what I can for you. That's a response that took me years to learn. I'm sorry, Doug.
No, I like the approach you had from Car Talk.
Yes.
The questions are highly intellectual and very well documented. The answers were by the two brothers who were crazier than a barn rat. You know, I mean, I loved that. That was my favorite program because they would argue between themselves over who had the right approach. You know, was it?
It's true.
And both of them were highly educated, intelligent,
Yes.
highly educated.
Harvard or MIT grads, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're just all highly confused, but
Well, but I think that's part of what goes into the remnant theology, as Jonathan is referring to it, is the fact that having the answers is a very comforting and empowering thing for people. And
Oh,
so,
yes.
you know, whether it be that God's action towards in a certain set of circumstances is consistent throughout time and in every situation, or whether one's faithfulness protects oneself from the kinds of judgment that clearly other people deserve. There's a comfort and empowerment in that. And so it makes me wonder if it's not the theology itself that's appealing, it's the comfort and the empowerment that's provided by the theology. Especially in a situation in a world where it seems like things are increasingly outside of one's control.
So it doesn't matter whether I'm right. It just matters that I think I'm right.
It's one way to put it.
yeah,
I think that's what you're saying. Yeah.
You know, at a certain time in life or a certain age, I shouldn't say that because I run into a whole lot of people who are my age and older that say stupid stuff. But I think you're right, Gene. I think there's a certain amount of comfort in expecting the outcome to always be the same. You know, it's always going to be the same. But if we go back to Job and his friends that surrounded him, you know, who thought they had all the answers, it pretty much convinces us that we should be listening to ourselves as well as to what other people are saying. I mean, you know, am I open to other people's understandings? Not that I agree with them.
Yeah.
But am I open to hearing them out?
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of just stupid stuff.
Right. And I think that's probably one of the more dangerous things for me about articulating such a theology is the implied almost control over God that seems to express, or at least imposing on God's prerogative to be God, that is, to be the supreme being and to act as God will, and then to posit yourself as the spokesperson for God. That seems to me to be the more dangerous thing inherent in articulating such a theology.
Well, I think there's a purity factor too. I think the idea is not just we're a remnant and we, you know, and I like what you're saying, Gene, about this comfort idea, but I think then when it's one thing to have it theologically that way, the other thing is to take that and apply that as a purity stance. If you don't think A, B, C, D, or in the church world, if you don't believe A, B, C, and D, and not just A, B, C, and D, but A sub A 0.1 exactly. It's like that joke, and I can't remember it in great detail, of the guy trying to talk the guy off the bridge from committing suicide, and he goes through all the things and finds out he's a heretic because of one particular little difference, so he pushes him off the bridge. You know, and that tends to be more, you know, I think when we interact with this in our world, it's the outworking of that purity mindset within the remnant. I am part of this remnant because I have it right. And it's comfort, but it's then I apply that standard to others. If you do not have that right, then you need to get right.
Right.
So everything we've said so far falls in line with my first description of remnant theology. When I use the word comfort in terms of that second understanding, it's simply in terms, not that we have the right answers, but that we are striving to be faithful even as the world pulls away from the church in general, not in the sense of having the right answers or thinking we do. So I'd like to pick up on the car talk thing that Doug is familiar with. Hopefully you guys are too. Because one of the things they would do, they'd get a caller, would have a problem, and each of them would suggest a solution. And then sometimes they would call them back a few months later to find out what was the outcome. They called it Stump the Chumps. And sometimes, remember that? Sometimes one of them was spot on, sometimes neither of them were. And you get the wah, 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 when neither of them had the right answer. There's the humility that first understanding of remnant theology never has.
Yeah. Well, that is the case, though, isn't it? I mean, the humility, as opposed to the sense of self-righteousness, and believing that there is a correct answer or a right answer or a right way. And I think that's, if there's anything that this coronavirus has created among those people having conversations, is that nobody has an answer to exactly what needs to be done. Nobody has a best way. There's no one method. When you're intellectualizing about theology, you can, go on for hours being right about your approach, but what happens in the end? Are we?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that's where Ray is pointing out a good thing. If we flip this and talk about the positive aspect of a remnant type of idea in theology. So I think if I use for United Methodism, one of my favorite services, church services for annual conference every year is the ordination service. Why? It's because we are setting aside a group of people for a special purpose. It is a remnant theology type idea. But there is a certain level of binding in that you go, these people have something in common with me. We are in the same place. And you do get that in a lot of different ways, whether it's through your employment field or maybe it's with your literal family. The question is, to me, part of the struggle is, as a church, we can really take in that good part, but if we're not careful, it flips to the bad part. If you don't look like me or sound like me or think like me, then because at a certain point, saying one side might be right, the other side might be right too. At a certain point, that breaks down. And maybe this is just the way I tend to view things. At some point, somebody has to be wrong. And the question is, what are they wrong about and how are they wrong? And I guess that goes back to what you're saying, Ray. I mean, sometimes neither have the correct answer.
Yeah, and I think even the impulse towards the either or, the right wrong kind of dichotomy is a cultural one, and we could get into that another time. But the kind of the thought that came to mind when Ray was talking about faithfulness or comfort when it came to being the remnant and comfort versus clinging to a remnant theology. The phrase that came to mind is the difference between faithfulness as a possession and faithfulness as a process. In other words, for certain people, faithfulness is something you have and you possess, whereas for others, faithfulness is something you strive for, something you're becoming, something that you're living into. And I think the problems arise when we get possessive about things that should be treated as processes.
I'm going to slice that more thinly and say I think it's possible to possess and be in process. You know, at least I would certainly hope so. And regarding the right and wrong, I had never articulated it this way, but I think when I look at our folks, and sometimes I try to comfort myself, it's a small group, but it's a remnant, I'm focusing on the idea that we are doing what we believe is right, but I'm not going that next step and saying, and all those other people are wrong. I'm suspending judgment on that. That is not my concern.
And I would disagree with that, in that at some point it is your concern, because by either not saying something's wrong, you further create harm, right? You know, I have to look at the Methodist axiom, do no harm, do good, stay in love with God. And if you tell me we're experiencing coronavirus directly because of Chinese people, I know you're not saying this, but I'm trying to use an example right now. We're experiencing this because of Chinese people, and therefore we should lash out against Chinese people. That's not that's an acceptable application. No, that's wrong.
It's not a neutral position.
No, but I do get what you're saying, Ray, is that, you know, some of our matters of faith really just do come down to opinion and allowing the opinions to be. But I think, you know, and the reason I wanted to bring this question to the group is because what I'm seeing in the online world is far more harmful. We are in this position because prayer's been taken out of school, because of gay people, and the list will go on. And you go, well, basically, to use another religious term, you're scapegoating, right?
Right.
It becomes less of a, you know, well, to hold either position doesn't do harm. This is actively harming. So that's where I would even push back on what you're saying a little bit.
I guess I'm thinking more specifically about doctrine and belief and theology, not other things. I would go as far as to say I believe that what we do in church on a Sunday morning is good and right, and there may be other ways to do it as well. I would certainly acknowledge that. And I'm constantly inviting people to try our way. Now, when you try to apply that to something like the coronavirus and, you know, an eschatological interpretation of it, then no, I think there are definitely some right and wrong answers. And I would never preach something like that, because that's biased and racist and uninformed.
And I know you wouldn't.
And this is Craig.
Well, one always needs a cat for their input.
Absolutely.
Though the cat doesn't need your input.
Yeah, that's right.
Nope. Never
And
takes it.
cat's choice may be good or bad based upon its own self-definition of what is either good or bad. So just be prepared for that.
Well, the other thing you were saying, you were talking about opinion. Is opinion based upon experience, or is opinion based upon what others are telling you, and so you form your opinion around a consensual kind of framework? That's what I was saying about people who enter into sobriety.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody has the same experience,
Right.
so, but each believes that that format or that methodology was what worked. But you know, maybe the other part of this thing is, as long as we remain in isolation and we don't experience life outside of our small comfort zones, maybe if we just stay there, we can maintain that same right and wrong mentality.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, once you enter into the other, once you get out of your comfort zone, it exposes you to a whole new way of looking at whatever it might be. And then we're back to what Gene was saying, in terms of it being safe or comfortable, or just how we process things out. I sometimes I don't think we give the people who are sitting in the pew or the people in our churches enough credit for being smart, for having their own experiences, and for having their own story to tell about how they came to that relationship, why they have an attitude or an opinion about faith. Is it something you possess, or is it something you're working on? But I think sometimes we don't give them enough credit, and it seems to me that there are those in the religious world who are trying to form everybody's opinion based on their experience.
Yeah.
So and that's uncomfortable for me.
Yeah.
Yes, do I believe there's right and wrong? Yeah, I'm always right until I'm wrong.
I won't make any clever remarks about married life right now.
No, this is being recorded.
Yeah, I know. I don't want a digital record of this. Actually, I am going to wrap us up right there. And I think this is a good exercise for showing we didn't have any answers, right, guys? I don't think we did. We didn't come out on this and say everybody should reject remnant theology or everybody should accept it. That wasn't the point of this. The point, I hope, for anybody who views this video is that you get to see there are differences of opinion amongst colleagues, and we wrestle with these just as much as some of our church people. I do appreciate each one of these people who've shared, and Doug, I appreciate what you were just pointing out of the experiences that our congregants bring to the table as well, and how that impacts this type of conversation. So as way of wrapping up, I'm going to talk with these gentlemen afterwards, see if we want to keep doing this, but I hope that this helps you in your faith and helps you to continue to develop more in your walk with Jesus Christ. All right, guys, everybody say bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.